When the message came across on my cell phone, I was at Kings Island Amusement Park in Cincinnati, Ohio, with my then 12-year-old son and my brother. My son and I were visiting the States, our family, for the summer, and he and my brother were about to get on the Beast, a roller coaster there at the park. The message read, ISIS has released a video showing James Foley's execution, and there was a link to the video. I wasn't interested in following that link. I didn't want to see that video. But that closed journalist forum where that message was coming across immediately started buzzing with messages from journalists all over the world. One was, this is not for publication. It hasn't yet been authenticated. Another that caught my attention was, at the end of the video, they say they're going to kill Steven Sotloff next. I didn't know Jim Foley. I'd seen him in passing when I'd worked in Libya, but Steve was a friend. He and I had hung out together in Libya, having meals together, consulting on different areas, working in different areas together. And after our coverage of Libya was finished, we'd stayed in touch. Late night Skype conversations, consulting about war zones. And I had known a year prior to getting that message that he was being held captive, and I was in touch with a family member of his, but they were keeping it secret, hoping that via secrecy, they could secure his release. The wash of emotions that came over me in that surreal setting, they were shock, disbelief, horror, and utter frustration. I had no one to share it with. I wasn't going to talk to my son or my brother. That would have been inappropriate. And the absurd thought that occurred to me was, James Foley will never go to another amusement park again, because I figured he was American. He must have grown up going to places like the one that I was in that moment. 2 weeks later, ISIS made good on their promise, and they killed Steve. And by that time, I was back in the Middle East, getting ready to deploy to eastern Ukraine. And friends of mine said, are you nuts? Why would you go to a war zone when 2 of your colleagues have just been executed? And technically, they were right. According to Reporters Without Borders statistics, there was a 35% uptick in journalist kidnappings last year. 91% of those happened in my neck of the woods, the Middle East. But I deployed, and I continue to deploy because I want to believe, perhaps naively so, that James Foley, Steven Sotloff, and the millions of victims of war, the countless number of people who I've encountered who have lost everything, their homes, their livelihoods, family members, that it's not in vain, and that perhaps by myself and my colleagues documenting their stories, it could make a difference. A colleague friend of mine says, why can't I just be happy buying a $100 dress and a matching pair of shoes? And I don't know why, but I'm right there with her. That's not what does it for me. I've been given the ability to be able to go into areas and stay reasonably not freaked out. And despite being terrified at times, despite being caught in sniper fire, mortar fire, despite being injured last year when a stun grenade exploded on my head, I continue to go back and back to document these stories. But part of what sends me back and back are what I call the moments of beauty, the glimmers of hope. And those are moments of gratitude, of kindness, of graciousness. They're few and far between, but when they happen, they're huge. And those are the moments that I'll share with you today. When I was in Aleppo, Syria, I was fortunate. I was traveling around with a group of savvy young Syrians who were able to hook us up to internet for a few hours every night to get us heat. This is in a place where the infrastructure had been bombed out. There was no electricity, no running water, no heat. It was the dead of winter. The Syrians around me weren't as lucky. I saw people who were hungry, standing in city blocks long lines, waiting for bread, just a bit of bread. Lines that were controlled by the Jabhat al-Nusra opposition group, who would shoot in the air to keep order. I admit, I prayed in Syria, in Aleppo, to get out alive. I counted the hours. as airstrikes were devastating the buildings around me. The buildings were shaking, and the devastation was, of course, people who were being killed. I was seeing dead people in the street, including one man who particularly sticks with me. He was lying in his own pool of blood with his head split open, and a family member came to identify his remains and was so overcome with grief that he began banging his head on an electric pole right there on the street. I mentioned Jabhat al-Nusra. I was interested in meeting opposition group members, and so this young, savvy group took me to a makeshift clinic. It had been a bakery, and they had rudimentary means there. They were treating people with thread and needle, rubbing alcohol at best. But the fighters, some of them were inside of that bakery. Regardless, let's leave aside that fighters had put themselves inside of a clinic/bakery. So we went there. I walked up to one who spoke English, and he immediately rebuffed me. He said, "We're not interested in talking to you. You're a journalist. You've done nothing for us. Assad is still in power. The war is still ongoing." And he was basically like, "Go on your way." But within a few hours, we were talking. We were laughing. And he and his armed-to-the-teeth fighter friends were doing rap together in the bakery, into the clinic, much to the amusement of some of the wounded people who were coming in from the airstrikes, who could laugh a little bit, perhaps forget what was happening with them for a few minutes. Eventually, they moved on to opera. They pulled me in when it came to the aria part, and I got to do soprano. At the end of the day, one of the fighters came up, and he took my hand, and he said, "Please, don't forget us. Please come back." As we rolled up to the checkpoint in eastern Ukraine, we didn't know what we would find. Checkpoints are controlled by armed people who are often angry, belligerent, drunk. They are armed. They can, and they have, decided to take everything we have, our gear, our flak jackets, our helmets, our money. Heck, they can kidnap or kill us because checkpoints in the middle of nowhere, well, there are no witnesses. And understandably, we were also jittery because days prior, we had been outside a supermarket in eastern Ukraine when a group of Russian-backed rebels raced their cars into the supermarket parking lot, jumped out, ran in. So Gil, the cameraman I work with, set up the camera on the tripod, and we said, "Let's just wait and see what happens here." Well, a few minutes later, we found out when those same rebels came running out, their AK-47s and pistols trained at us, and were threatening to kill us. We threw our hands in the air, we begged for our lives, screamed, "We're journalists." It turned out that what they'd been doing was looting that supermarket, and they didn't want it to be documented. And it wasn't until Gil erased that memory card in front of them inside the camera that they agreed to put their weapons down. So back to that checkpoint, as we rolled up, the main person guarding it, his AK-47 at us, asked through our interpreter where we were from. She told him. And then he looked at me and he said, "Tell me, how do you say tank in English?" And then I knew we were okay. And what ensued was a lot of questions, a lot of words he wanted to know in English, mostly military related. He also asked, "What does the world think? What does America think of what's happening here?" And I get that question very often in conflict zones. He also showed me pictures of his family that were on his cell phone. He shared with me some of the poetry he'd written, and he quoted Shakespeare. So I had to ask him, because he wasn't your run-of-the-mill checkpoint guard, "What are you doing here?" And he hesitated. He wasn't sure. But then he pulled out a stock answer from his pocket, it seemed, which was, "I must defend my family and my country." Meeting him didn't erase the encounter of days prior being held at gunpoint, but it did go a long ways in softening it. The refugee crisis that is now plaguing the world is a conundrum for governments that I understand. To take refugees, not to, how many to take, how to fund those people, and how to vet between refugees, asylum seekers, and extremists that are hiding out in between. I will say this, however. Right now, there's a war raging in Aleppo, Syria, for control of Aleppo. Refugees are at the doorstep. There's going to be a new flood. Would-be politicians who advocate barring entire demographic groups from countries as a solution are adding to the problem by fomenting hatred. Yanis Barakis is a Reuters photographer who just won the Guardian's Photographer of the Year award for his work in covering refugees. And one of the things that he says is, it's emotionally devastating, and I'm never sure if I'm doing enough. And I'm right there with Yanis. I have been covering the refugee crisis since war broke out in Syria 5 years ago, in every country bordering Syria, inside Syria, and in Europe. And I will say this, that at the end of the day, when I leave the children who are running around in sandals in the snow, the people who are deathly ill because there's raw sewage running through camps, the people who are hungry because they don't have enough to eat, they go back to the motel with me, even if it's a rundown dump of a motel, and they're with me as I have a hot shower, I eat a hot meal, and I sit in a heated room. Not every story has a glimmer of hope, a moment of beauty. Most don't. Most of the deployments don't. However, as I said, when they do, they're huge, and they propel at least me to keep going forward. And when they're not there, my only hope is that myself and my colleagues are the hope for the people whose stories that we are telling. I'm going to leave you with a clip, a story that we did where there was no hope. And I will admit, in the last frame you'll see the bus taking off. In the final frame of this clip, I stood by the side of the road as that bus took off, and I cried, because I couldn't imagine making the choice that the people I encountered that day were making. Thank you.
CCTV's Stephanie Freid has our story.
Mournful goodbyes. They don't know when or if they'll see their loved ones again. Syria's refugees fled airstrikes and shelling for the safety of Jordan, now saying they are caught in an impossible situation, they are choosing to return to the nightmare.
Safety? There's no safety there. My house was demolished. I have no house to go back to. I'll have to live in a tent. But the aid coupons we get here aren't enough, and we aren't allowed to work.
Aid agency budgets are diminishing. Straining to support 4 million Syrian refugees, NGOs are cutting programs, including food aid. Refugees fleeing Syria outnumber those who choose to go back, but aid agency and camp officials see a growing trend of return.
The
numbers are increasing because people hear about more and more areas taken over by the Free Syrian Army, so they tell us they want to go back to their country and their families.
It is a perilous choice.
The dangers awaiting them inside Syria are well known. But the danger begins even before they get to the border. One of the Jordanian officers here told me that sometimes on the way to the border, the buses are targeted.
Targeted by factions fighting inside the very towns they are heading for. As they move toward the border, silence, contemplation, and more tears. For some, the decision to go back is born of longing. Separated from parents, siblings, and even children for years, they want to reunite, even at the risk of their own lives. Stephanie Freid, CCTV, Zaatari Refugee Camp, Jordan.
Thank you very much.